Hi everyone, I'd like to talk to you about a subject which, while growing in popularity, especially in recent years, is still quite misunderstood. I'll get onto some of the reasons for that in a little while, but I have been investigating and researching all things anomalous for about 19 years now. And quite early on in my paranormal journey, in my career, I encountered a case of an allegedly haunted object. Now, admittedly for me, at first it was quite difficult for me to take seriously and quite a difficult subject for me to really understand. And I think the reason for that is that historically, everything I'd read and every case I'd ever heard about relating to a haunting referred to a building and a location. So the idea that actually an inanimate object could also display some form of paranormal activity, it's quite difficult for me to take seriously. I think one of the problems actually comes about because the term haunted isn't very helpful. I wonder what comes to mind for most of you when I say those two words, haunted objects. No, not that. That's not what I mean by a haunted object. I think Hollywood has quite a lot to answer for actually when it comes to our overall understanding and expectation of what is or is not a haunted object. So let's have a look at the word haunted. Why isn't it helpful? The Oxford Dictionary defines haunted as a place frequented by a ghost. Now, straight away we're running into trouble here because we all have our own individual understanding or our own individual beliefs around what is or is not a ghost. And the truth is we don't actually even know, really. But if we assume for a moment that we all have the same beliefs and the same ideas about what is or is not a ghost, let's look at the first part of that definition because that's the part that's interesting here. A place frequented by a ghost. So it's somewhere, not something, but somewhere frequented by a ghost. As I said before, historically, we've always linked that word haunted to a location, not an object. And so it's understandable why for a lot of people it's quite a difficult thing to accept as a potentially genuine phenomena, because we only ever think of buildings and places as being haunted. But if you believe that a building can be haunted, that a large inanimate object, in terms of physics made of nothing but particles, if you believe that that large inanimate object can be haunted, what are you believing? You're believing that some level of energy, emotions, events can somehow be retained, can be absorbed and replayed at specific times. Even maybe that some level of consciousness is able to remain within a building or location. Well, it's not too great a leap then for me to suggest that actually smaller inanimate objects could potentially be capable of doing the same. Remember, some people actually don't form any real bond to bricks and mortar, especially if they've moved around a lot. But if they've had a treasured possession, something which they've kept with them all throughout their lives, something that meant a lot to them, isn't it entirely feasible, if we're going to believe that buildings, large inanimate objects, can be haunted, can retain energy, then isn't it entirely feasible to believe that smaller inanimate objects can do the same? A study carried out in 2014 on the YouGov website found that 1 in 3 people in the UK believe that a house can be haunted. I wonder what those statistics would be if we were to ask those people, do you believe an object can be haunted? I'd put my money on it being significantly less than 1 in 3. But if for a moment we look at those two potential types of phenomena as one and the same, haunted buildings, haunted objects, both actually just inanimate objects, which some people believe can retain and replay emotions and events, energy, usually heightened energy. If we assume for a moment that this is happening, well, how might it be happening? Most experts in the field of paranormal investigation, and actually most people who simply have an interest and a passion in the paranormal, will be familiar with the theory of emotional connections. So the theory that if you have a strong emotional bond to somewhere or something, that heightened energy transfers, an emotional connection causing energy transference. Now, if we believe that this is possible, why would it only apply to buildings? As I've said before, some people form no real bond to bricks and mortar, but they may have a very special item, a wedding ring, for example, a pocket watch, even a doll. If they've had something all of their lives and it meant something to them, isn't it entirely possible that that emotional connection may have caused this energy transference, not to the building around them, but to their favourite object, their favourite possession? Does psychometry potentially support this? Now, psychometry is literally soul measuring. It's taken from two Greek words, psych, meaning soul, and metron, meaning measuring. So when you're performing psychometry as a psychometrist, what you're doing is measuring the soul of an object. That's the definition. Some of you will be familiar with psychic mediums who claim to be able to perform psychometry. And basically they will hold an object, and while holding the object they'll begin to relay information about that object, a previous owner maybe, names, dates, in a similar way that they would if they were to enter an allegedly haunted building. Now, we're all probably familiar with the stone tape theory, the theory which suggests that the very fabric of the building can record, retain and replay events and emotions, much like a tape recorder. And as I said before, if this is possible, isn't it entirely feasible that all objects could potentially be recording our energy all of the time? Now, this isn't a new idea by any means. Professor Joseph Rhodes Buchanan was an American professor of physiology, and he was one of the first to experiment with psychometry. In fact, he coined the term psychometry. He used his students in his trials, and he placed identical looking drugs into glass vials. He asked his students to identify the drug simply by holding the glass vial. Now, apparently the results, the success rate, was above what Buchanan had expected by chance alone. And so, to explain these results, Buchanan suggested that every single object has a soul which is capable of retaining memory. Now, this is a difficult concept for us to take seriously or to begin to understand, because as human beings, we consider the soul as something that only really applies to us, maybe animals as well, but certainly something with flesh and blood. But because we don't really know what the soul is, we only have our own definition, it's entirely possible, actually, that everything in the natural world has a soul. This ability to record and retain memory of our experiences. As I've said before, this idea is not a new one. In ancient Japanese folklore, there is a belief known as tsukumogami. Tsukumogami is the belief that once an object reaches its 100th birthday, it becomes self-aware, it becomes alive, it obtains a soul. Now again, very difficult for us to comprehend and quite controversial, but whatever your belief is about that, what it does show is this historical, cross-cultural interest that there seemingly has always been in this idea that objects are more than they appear. And going back to the idea of everything having a soul, what about animism? Animism is potentially the oldest religious belief we have. It predates paganism and actually now forms one of the core foundational beliefs of paganism. Animism is the belief that everything, from people to places to animals and objects, everything possesses a distinct spiritual essence. I won't go into animism too much here, as it's actually a whole other talk in itself, but anyone interested in learning more about animism, I'd recommend the book The Wakeful World by Emma Restel Orr. It really explains the ideas and the beliefs around animism in quite a straightforward and accessible way. But back to why this might be happening. Vibrations. The theories around vibrations are some of the theories that actually get the most attention from researchers, because we can potentially prove them or disprove them. We can measure vibrations. Now, Gustav Pagenstecker was a German doctor and psychical researcher, and around 1920 he discovered psychometric abilities in one of his patients, a lady named Maria Reis de Girold. Now, Maria could hold an object and place herself in a trance. And while in a trance, she could relay information about what they later described as that object's experience in the world. Now, to explain this, Pagenstecker suggested that psychometrists are actually just tapping into vibrations condensed, held within an object, put there by its environment, maybe its previous owners. Now, this theory can be taken one step further, and indeed it has been. Some people suggest that objects actually have their own aura. Is this what we're seeing in Chilean photography? Now, I must confess here that I'm not 100% convinced about Chilean photography, but again, what it does show is this interest in the idea that objects really are more than they appear. In Chilean photography, an object is placed on a metal plate and subjected to a high electrical charge. It can be anything from a leaf to a coin to a piece of fruit, absolutely anything. But the resulting photograph apparently shows that object's aura. Now, if we accept that indeed objects do have their own auras, could this explain why some objects apparently seem to affect the atmosphere they're in, the environment they're in? British painter Lucian Freud very much believed that objects give out energy. He believed that in order to create his very best work, he not only had to be completely aware of an object's appearance, so its size, its shape, its colour, but he believed he also had to be acutely aware of that object's energy, of its aura, and the effect that that energy had in the space around it. Again, if objects can affect the space around them, could this be why some people describe some objects as haunted? Is it simply a case of residual energy tipping the balance? I'll give you a brief example of the kind of case I've worked on over the years. In 2004, we visited a home in the Ladywood area of Birmingham. We were called by a young lady whose father had become really quite ill, very unexpectedly. He was very weak, fatigued, headache, nausea, and he was spending a lot of time sleeping. Now, doctors came in and out, 2 or 3 different doctors I think, and no one could really diagnose the problem. They simply suggested, lots of rest and fluids. But he seemed to get worse, and so we were called in. His daughter said that she'd begun feeling a presence in the home, something quite oppressive watching her when she was there. Now, we spent a couple of weeks and we did various experiments, as we usually do. We interviewed the family and neighbours and friends. There was nothing really untoward, nothing really suspicious to us at least. We got some unusual readings, but nothing that would make us think we really need to investigate this further. However, a couple of days before leaving, we brought in a psychic medium. She walked around the house, and when she went into the gentleman's bedroom, she went straight to a bedside drawer. She opened it and took out a very old pocket watch, similar to this one. It was almost as if she knew it was there. She held it for a few moments, and she began telling me that the previous owner of this watch had been a very cruel man, a very violent man, and that negative energy had indeed been absorbed by the watch. She believed that it was this negative energy that had been introduced to this gentleman's home that was causing him to feel ill. Apparently he was very sensitive. Not everyone would be affected by it. Now, of course, it could have been a coincidence, but we decided to test the theory. We took the watch away, we bagged it, labelled it, and we didn't tell the gentleman or his daughter. We just asked them to keep in touch with us for a few days, let us know if anything changes. Now, it took less than 2 days actually for his daughter to call me to say that the gentleman had got out of bed, gone downstairs, made a cup of tea and seemed to be feeling better. Now, as I've said, obviously this could be a coincidence, but it's not an isolated case. I've seen hundreds like this, where an object, for whatever reason, once brought into the home, can begin to tip the balance, can begin to have usually a negative effect on sensitive people. Now, at this point, we didn't know. The gentleman could have owned the watch for years himself. But when we returned with the watch and told them the story that the psychic medium had told us, we were quite shocked to hear that the gentleman had actually only bought the watch 2 days before beginning to feel ill. I say shocked to hear, not really, 50-50. We've seen this kind of thing before, and the psychic medium was adamant that this watch was the cause of the negativity in the house. Now, they threw the watch away. They didn't want to take any chances, of course. But yeah, it could have been coincidence. But I've seen enough cases like that for me to believe that in some cases, some objects can affect some people. Now, what I've spoken about so far has largely been what we would refer to as residual energy or residual haunting. What about those people who believe that they have an object that is haunted by a spirit? And by spirit, I mean something with consciousness, a level of intelligence, something that can communicate potentially. Well, I'll start here by saying there is no such thing as a ghost in a jar, despite what many eBay listings want us to believe. You cannot contain something non-physical. You can't capture a ghost or a spirit in a jar. That just doesn't happen. And because it doesn't happen, well, we're not likely to see anything like this anytime soon. I think if we could capture and contain hauntings, ghosts and spirits, well, we probably wouldn't have many haunted locations left. So what are we dealing with then? If someone owns an object and they believe that for whatever reason they're in communication with a spirit as a direct result of owning that object, how could this be happening? Well, this will depend entirely on your belief around the psychology of hauntings. But if you're in the camp that believes that we can indeed be in touch with those in the afterlife, that some level of consciousness does remain post-death, then why would we only assume that that can occur within a building or a location? The stone tape theory has already been thrown into question. After all, people see soldiers on battlefields where there is no building around. If we believe that some form of emotional connection can cause someone to remain in a place post-death, maybe it's a heightened level of sadness, fear. People often hear of hauntings in places where people have been murdered, for example. Maybe it's the theory that that heightened energy at the point of death has somehow become trapped and stuck in limbo. Maybe. If you subscribe to that belief, then it's entirely possible that that energy could also become trapped and absorbed by something else. Likewise, how about a positive emotional connection? As we've said before, there's a belief out there that if we love a place, the Grey Lady haunting the manor house, for example, well, people suggest that maybe she lived there and she's still roaming the corridors, still keeping an eye on the place because she loves it. Couldn't that be entirely possible with an object? Couldn't someone choose to remain with a treasured possession even in death, especially if they don't know that they're dead? It's something we hear quite a bit about when it comes to buildings. So why not smaller objects as well? Now, I'm not here to convince anyone that haunted objects are a genuine phenomena, and I've seen plenty of cases where they're absolutely not. But what I have seen also are cases where I can't quite explain exactly what's happening, much in the same way that I can't exactly explain what's going on in some buildings and locations. And so because I can't explain it, I have to keep an open mind. Now, we know with psychometry and psychic mediums that there are other theories about what's going on there, cold reading being quite a credible one. How about telepathy? How about collective consciousness? Is there a swirling database of information around all of us all of the time? Maybe psychic mediums and psychometrists simply tap into that. Or maybe they genuinely do read vibrations or information somehow held and stored within an object. Because we don't really know, we're no more certain of any one theory than another, we have to keep that open mind. And for me, because I do believe in an afterlife, I just don't believe that hauntings are as common as we're made to believe. But because I do believe that some level of our consciousness, whether it's simply our energy or even elements of our personality, because I do believe that they do remain in some form after the death of our physical body. After all, energy can't be destroyed, it can only be displaced. Because I believe that energy is displaced into the world around us, then I have to believe that that refers to the world in its entirety, not just a building, not just a battlefield, but absolutely everything. That's why for me, I believe that objects can be haunted, but not necessarily in the way that the word suggests.